So this chapter is called Power, Politics, and Violence. In the last section, we were learning about groupings, various ways that humans organize themselves, and we are starting to talk about how sometimes those organizations are vertical or hierarchical. So some groups of people and some at some places and times are considered above or below other groups of people. And the way that that gets enforced, the way that that happens and that perpetuates itself, is through the ability of one group to have power of politics and sometimes the use of violence, and we're going to learn more about that. But before we get into that too much, I want to examine something that's called a panopticon. So this is going to get a little bit abstract, but I think it is a good way to philosophically think about how power is exercised over people. So a panopticon, panopticons were created by an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, and designed in the 18th century. They were primarily designed as prisons at the time. So if you see these pictures on the right, they're these big circular buildings that are kind of hollow on the inside. Sometimes they have a roof, sometimes they don't, and they typically will have a tall guard tower in the middle, and all the prison cell of all the different prisoners are arranged around the outside. So all inmates of an institution can be observed by a single guard, right? So just one single guard, maybe two, could be in this tower, and the shape and the construction, the invention of this panopticon allows really really efficient control because just a few guards can be watching hundreds and hundreds of inmates at any given time. And before that, you couldn't really do that. You couldn't really watch that many people, excuse me, and exercise that much control over them with a relatively few number of guards. So the thing about this is it's impossible for a single guard to actually be watching all of the prisoners at any given time. So if you're a prisoner and you're in one of these cells, you know that it's probably unlikely that at any specific time the guard is looking directly into your cell and observing what you're doing and making sure that you're following the rules. But the prisoners cannot know when they are being watched, and that's because in the prison tower there'll be little slats and poke holes and peepholes and things like this, kind of to obfuscate the image of the guard. So they're not sure if the guard is watching them at any given time. They can't be sure. They could be being watched. So it motivates the prisoners to act as though they're being watched at all times. If you never know when you're being watched, then at any given time it's possible that you're being watched. So thus, the panopticon as a device, as a tool, as a philosophical idea, the panopticon compels the prisoners to regulate their own behavior, right? So rather than an external force, as in maybe somebody following you around all day, every day, 24 hours a day, holding a gun to your head and saying, follow the rules or I'm going to shoot you. In that case, you would know 100% all of the time that the person is following you around and they will shoot you if you don't follow the rules. However, it would be really inefficient if you have a population of millions of people. For every person, they would have to have one other person following them around. This is much more efficient because it conduces prisoners to regulate their own behavior and act as if there is a guard watching them. So this is a long quote. You don't have to memorize it or anything like that, by a famous philosopher named Michel Foucault that you'll read in other sociology classes, but it's about the panopticon. So to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures automatic functioning of power. So to arrange things that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its actions. That the perfection of power should tend to render its actual exercise unnecessary. That this architectural apparatus should be a machine for creating and sustaining power relations, independent of the person who exercises it. In short, that the inmate should be caught up in a power situation in which they are themselves the bearer. So I like this quote because it really gets at the power of the panopticon in a lot of ways. So here are some panoptic prisons from France that are no longer being used. They're sort of deserted. But I like some of these quotes. The perfection of power, so that its actual use to exercise that power is totally unnecessary. to making power and using power so efficiently that you never even have to tell people or force them to follow the rules. They just do it by themselves. So why am I bringing this up? Well, let's not get that far. Actually, let's talk about these are obviously abandoned prisons. They are no longer in use. So maybe you might think that with all the technology and all the advances that we've had since the 1800s, that we don't really do this anymore. But in fact, if I this is a point where I normally ask the class, have you ever seen a panopticon? Can you think of any popular references to it? And usually people aren't able to. But actually, if you saw Guardians of the Galaxy, then you did see a panopticon. So here it is in 2014, and this is the prison that all the Guardians of the Galaxy initially get put into. And there's obviously some sci-fi and futuristic changes. There's the guards there are still human guards in the tower, and you can see that you can't quite see the guard because there's these slats. The prison is set up in a panopticon like the classic French prisons, but there's these sort of hovering, flying robots that have guns on them and things like that. But it's interesting to me that even in the future, or even in sci-fi, where we could imagine any number of different kinds of technologies, we could imagine invisible guards or guards that are these gigantic robot tanks and things like that. They still use this structure of the panopticon because it still really does exert a kind of power over people. So, and that's what I have this little thing I've written on the left. Even in the distant imagined future, with almost infinite technological innovation, the panopticon is still the most formidable means of social control. So now I'm actually looking at my next slides ahead of time, so I don't have to switch. But again, that same question, do we still use panopticons? There's these panopticons I've shown you in the 1800s that were popular as prisons in some parts of the world. And then, in the future, when we think of like an awful, terrible prison, we go to the panopticon. But what about today? Surely we don't use panopticons today. Well, actually, panopticons are used in a lot of ways. Now, some of these panopticons are physical structures that help to regulate people and their social behavior in certain situations through the structure of a place. And other panopticons, I'd like to get a little, I'd like to back up a little and just be a little bit more flexible in how we think about panopticons. Some panoptic systems are social structures that keep people from misbehaving. So here at the top left, we actually have a library. So the librarian is able to view the entire library at any given time. It might help to keep people from stealing books or generally breaking the rules of a library, chewing gum, talking too loud, because the librarian would be able to figure out very quickly who it is who is doing the problem. On the top right, I think this is actually from a movie, so I apologize, but we've certainly seen images such as this. This might be a camera system in LA controlling the stoplights and stop signs. It could be in an airport, a large international airport. It could even be in a shopping mall in the security room. The new panoptic system, one of the big technologies is cameras. So a lot of stores I've been to, they actually have cameras, but to some extent you don't even need a camera because just the camera doesn't have to actually be working. If you're a convenience store or something like that, you could just put dummy cameras everywhere, and it would have almost the same effect. People would go in thinking that they're being filmed all the time, and they would regulate their own behavior. And the store or the convenience store that has lots of these dummy cameras in it would probably be a lot less likely to be robbed than a convenience store that had hidden cameras, even if those hidden cameras were working. Because maybe the robbers wouldn't know that there are cameras there, so they might think that it's an easy place to knock off. So just the threat of the use of surveillance typically will get human beings to follow the rules, follow whatever the system of power is. And even in the classroom, now normally I'd say, oh, we're in a classroom and you're all actually in a panopticon right now because you're all staring at me, but I can see out over all of you and you're all sort of forced to listen to me, and if anybody starts talking on their cell phone or something like that, I'll easily be able to pinpoint you and help to regulate your behavior. So panopticons, be they physical structures, be they social structures, as an abstract concept, are used all the time, probably even more today than they've ever been used in history. So this is a point where I would break you up and I'd ask, how do you think the concept of the panopticon is useful? Name three panoptic systems in the United States. Make them as vastly different as you can. Bend your brain. You can bend your brains to allow. Uh, who controls these? Who is controlled by them? And how is this control produced? Students have brought up lots of different kinds of panoptic systems, such as red light cameras. Some students have thought about hospitals, particularly mental institutions. Another one that I liked was Facebook tracking your cell phone, and the government now can send you text messages if there's a hurricane or something like that. But that's also a panoptic system because now you have a little GPS system in your pocket. Maybe that causes you to regulate your behavior in some ways, and maybe it doesn't. So, social control, the functions of politics. Social control, I'm going to define as the political and general social function of getting members of a group to conform to expectations and rules and to obey authority. Includes incalculating of social values, inculcating of social values, as well as punishment of deviance from expectation. Now, we do want a certain level of social control. Imagine if we went out or we're driving one day, and there was no system of social control. Everybody knew that there were going to be no police officers that day, and that the red light cameras were all going to be turned off. Would people act differently? Would it be a good day to go for a drive? I think there'd be probably a lot of pandemonium. There'd be a lot of recklessness. So a certain amount of social control is good for everybody. Everybody benefits from certain social controls because we can expect certain people to obey a certain way, to act a certain way, right? Just like we were talking with language, being able to expect a person to understand language is incredibly important. Now, we also need to be aware of agents of control. So, agents of control are people who do the controlling. That's parents, peers, priests, professors, police, prison guards, parole officers, and presidents and prime ministers. Agents of control, agents of social control apply externalized control. That's power from without, and encourage members of society to practice the discipline that leads to internalized control through an administration of sanctions. And we'll get into more of that later. But I'd like to point out to you that you're all agents of control in some situations. Now, right now, if I were standing in front of all of you and I was looking at you and you were supposedly listening to me very, very astutely, or maybe right now you're at home looking at your cell phone while you watch this. Then I'm not an agent of control because I can't tell you, hey, Michael, get off your phone. But if I were in the classroom and you were misbehaving or causing a problem, you were talking really loudly or hitting other students, I don't know, anything that you're not supposed to do in class, I would say, hey, get out of here, and I would be an agent of control because I'm the professor in a classroom, and in that situation, I'm an agent of control. But most of you are agents of control in other situations, just by way of being a friend or peer, even. When your friends do something stupid in public, you might roll your eyes at them. You might say, hey, that was really dumb, the thing you did. And you might put social pressure on them in some way, an externalized control, to not do that behavior. So that gets us into this idea about externalized controls versus internalized controls. So externalized controls are what we've been talking about primarily up until this point, which is the source of social control that lies outside of the individual, in the form of individuals, groups, and institutions with the power to sanction behavior, such as parents, teachers, police, and governments, which we've just talked about. But remember, the goal of the panopticon, right? The goal of someone who wants to have maximum control over a population with minimal input. That's the panopticon. Maximum control with minimum amount of input, minimum amount of actual power being exerted or being wasted. And you want to internalize your control. So internal control is a form or source of social control in which individuals make themselves conform to social expectations through the internalization of rules and norms by enculturation, which we talked about on day one of this class. Enculturation is a process of internalizing certain rules and controls. So these are social rules and norms become part of the personality of the members, right? So even if tomorrow we said that, you know what, you don't have to wear clothes anymore. That's no longer illegal. You can walk around naked as much as you want. The vast majority of people probably would not rip off their clothing and start running around the streets of Chicago naked, showing up for work. That's because you've internalized that rule. That's not normal. You've already been enculturated into a society that wears clothing, and so that's very unlikely of you to have to do. And in fact, we very rarely have to send police out to stop some scofflaw that's running around the city naked, because most people are enculturated, and most people just don't break that rule. So that's an internalized rule, so we rarely have to use an external force in order to make sure that rule is upheld. I'm going to pause the video here. This is a good place to stop.